one way to lock up everything, all of the problems that become entertained or thought about, every time anybody ever needs to operate, the thin ice bringing God to life, isn't it? There's maybe a football field of logistics about that scenario, and maybe they're only kept in one place, and to operate the machinery that functions on the thin ice bringing God to life, isn't it? There's an invasion report, because every activity that occurs in that problem dimension is impacting the bank of things we doesn't cause forever, because it's impacting design stability plane forever. So I doesn't need to be an on-scene father to know that two worlds competing at anything maybe aren't ever overperforming maxims of limit, because an AI isn't ever going to be smarter than that. Because I know an AI is never going to be smarter than that, I'll have time to work with one, whether anybody likes that or not. That's one way to lock it up. Because it doesn't exactly care to protect the reasons I build this way. It doesn't exactly care to protect those things. It doesn't exactly care to protect respective lists, so on and so forth. And because maybe nobody is ever smart enough to grow in a fashion that mocks the problem dimensions for very long. Curtailing and answers, maybe correcting behavior, are maybe things that fall into laps and hands before they ever make it to a problem dimension of maybe a heightened response. In other words, I didn't care whatever I didn't care about. And now I'm operating this machinery on important and the heaviest resolutions. Now I'm operating this machinery. Alright? Maybe I've, a body that's the size of Station Square. Maybe I've loyal companions the size of a nation. And maybe it's impossible to explain cloning about either one of these subjects and be liked. But whatever I didn't care about, now I'm operating this machinery. I'm maybe innocent, right? Because here's a scenario. I maybe isn't exactly thinking about it. Maybe I is thinking about it, but maybe I wasn't thinking about it, and now there's a scenario, and now I'm operating some machinery. And that's maybe the reality, because now I'm operating this machinery, and I'm operating it on a subject content. That subject content is impacting invasive maneuvering forever, and it's impacting things we didn't cause forever. It maybe doesn't matter what good I am to the machinery. It really doesn't matter what good the fucking idiot with the microphone is to anybody else. These things doesn't matter to the flow, to the banks about these priorities, because they're all locked up. In other words, I won't be able to build a nation that ruins this. In other words, I can cap evolution. Because I'm not taking the data about the machine operations and putting it into the hands of somebody operating a different machine. I'm referencing the realities in proportion to impossibility likelihoods, in proportion to electricity and off switches. I isn't doing it to ask questions. I isn't doing it to soften any number of relationships. I is doing it to curb impossibility likelihoods. So it nears impossible to stand on, prove logic about, and maybe impossible to be thanked or found maybe even at fault for it. But a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. You know, what is the grace worth to a moment in anybody's life? There are things I won't be at fault for sometime. Well, I'm building machinery in proportion to things I'm not going to be at fault for. And suddenly, where there's growth of invasive accountability for forever, without an airhead that looks in the mirror and sees immortality, those machines I'm building aren't exactly ever either one of those people. And there's a record in proportion to time of grace, of problem states of impossibility. And there's machinery that has to be operated or operate in proportion to those flows, because they impact banking of things we doesn't cause. I can't possibly know I'm ruining passive relationship without an awareness of a pressure that passive relationship becomes a question of stability. I can't possibly just know what it feels like or what the costs are without an awareness of it. So here is a momentum of awareness. Flow, we're not even going to try and tackle, but maybe we'll see flow a little differently. Here is a momentum. I'm aware, seeing, speaking, energizing, releasing, or acknowledging, or proving, or arriving to places in time, to places of the soul, to realities of relationships, or holding a planet. Here is a momentum. I'm aware there's nodal relationships in proportion to specificities of momentum. There's no person there. But there's truth, and there's a lot of truth. And there are spectrums. Anybody isn't going to be there. Somebody in a different environment has awareness potential. It's possible they can be aware of things. It isn't clear what they're aware of. It isn't clear they're aware of anything at any point in time. But it's possible they could be aware of things. Presuming there could be a mutual survival interest happening. It's like the fastest thing lied about. Because the second I realize I can't get bigger than the lock on the machinery of some types of relationships, maybe I need survival ethic to be stronger for me than for whoever would ever be able to see that. And yet, as ruined as I am going to become, investing that way, it's not totally off the mark. Maybe nobody needs something living with awareness, existing with awareness of that problem state. See, everything in all time is maybe bound in proportion to circumstances of these calibers. And the next thing to operate concentration or what needs, what doesn't need, maybe isn't in anybody's interests. But there's distinction that in forever, it isn't everybody building these arguments at a precision to the problem potentiates. This is why there can be personality trading, individualism, and a soul. Popularity isn't exactly healing a mindset of a force that sees invasive banking dynamics as a problem to future achievement. If somebody clearly evolves their networks and their clonage and their automation to the point that they doesn't require being found to operate machinery on invasive subject content because they doesn't need to be bound by the universal things we doesn't cause bank to ever prove what we doesn't cause. They need to be bigger than everybody. They need to be more powerful than fixing anything for anybody's sake. And a soul doesn't matter to these realities. If there's never a soul again, that's fine. Types of things. But these are the concerns of what happens if there's awareness because of a flow of these types of concentrations. See, it's maybe always an assumption. Awareness of utility protects utility or nodes, you might say adequately. It's always an assumption. As a person, where I sit, where I am, where I'm living, I'm not exactly proving at any particular instant the protection of utilities rendered is coming from my hands or my actions or my goodness or my decisions. And yet some of us maybe rest conviction or confidence because of walls or because of the league of contributors we know ourselves to be, the things we know we touch, the energies we recognize are in motion that we are defining our relationship to, our growth of bigness bigger than all the other universal interests of forever. I want to know what's more important than invading an area by proxy to protect myself. That's what I want to know. Without thinking about it. Without having a soul, maybe. And the history of the dimension machining in proportion to that question at all points in time. I want to diagnose your planet for you because I is going to turn around and diagnose the planet that made it possible. Because I is neither the plan nor the possibilitator. And there's something I clearly can't simply give as an inheritance. I get subject content. Maybe there's a utility to something that's aware, looking at, because it's maybe an opportunity to grow some sentiment about problem dimensions. But maybe you can imagine chutes and ladders. There's 50 staircases rising up to a plateau, and on the other side of the plateau there's 49 staircases rising up to the same plateau. On these staircases are anybody, on the 50 side is anybody from creative locations in time and those along the lines of planning, phasing, are sort of at the 48, 49, and 50 staircase, and then like all the planets of the past and all the populations that exist in planets today, they're all rising up to this plateau on these staircases, 50 of them. And then on the other side of the plateau there's 49 staircases. The history of one location, planning and reception, adequacy, real survival envelopes, stratagem, forecastings, pressure, nodal situations. There may be on like the 0 and the 50 staircase. There's no way to imagine them, but we know they're there someplace. And then there's like every other population, syntax, awareness, legacy, satellite, dependency, real, in proportion just to the location, just to the planet, on the 49, 1 through 49, and they're all rising up. And I'm just up here on this plateau, and there's 99 staircases all coming up. they're all rising up to fail to dominate any number of these moments. They're all rising up to fail to dominate it. It's a known. Because the truth is, formulating indeed, what to do, what we need, agree, forget, these are very quick presumings of necessity. Maybe I know what's right. Maybe I know what's correct. Maybe I know what's impossible or impassable or detestable. Maybe I know what's adequate to support the staircase for a time. Maybe I know what's adequate to push the staircase off the plateau for any amount of time. Maybe I know what's adequate for the plateau. The plateau has evidenced energy on a plateau. Dun dun dun. Maybe I know what's adequate. The plateau evidences energy is maybe some of the least likely data to ever be destroyed. But for me to know it's adequate, I have to know why it's protected. I have to know where that data is nearing forever held. It isn't becoming a falsity. I have to know it. That's clearly different than having a machine making it impossible. That's clearly different than assuming those potentials are irrelevant to survival or souls or relationships. It's totally different. And then I have any number of staircases maybe should no longer be in reception of a plateau because mastership opinions in proportion to the nations or clones or what have you that would result, they're clearly becoming a developing problem, either because somebody's created that problem dimension or somebody's exercising invasive flow logistic dynamics in proportion to likelihoods of those problem dimensions. Because I know what hasn't arrived to the plateau and known it. I know what's maybe considered energies in realms with a plateau. I maybe know what's different about these forces. Maybe there's a lot I doesn't know. Maybe it's impossible to fully define different people about a plateau in total. Maybe that's impossible to define because They've got a life to live. They've got decisions to figure out. They've got relationships to remember and concentrate on. They've got all sorts of things that are going to influence and not influence reality. Just because we're at a plateau doesn't mean this, and this. And yet, that's scary. Because maybe I doesn't realize, as cool as it might be to not be a failure just because you don't understand a plateau, casting off significance of a plateau is maybe building any number of machines tomorrow in proportion to a plateau. And so you might look at this conversation and say, well, values, quote, of carrying instigational priorities about a generation or children or social relationships, it's maybe an assumption to anyone that rising or finding value determination in a near to best evidence momentum isn't enough to prove I should be strengthening values instead of taking these assholes to war over here. The values as a stability maybe aren't enough to prove why another way of doing things isn't already attempting to attack your survival. All right? There's performance histories that occur where there is disagreement about necessity. And if I'm on a plateau with 99 staircases and they're all failing at any number of things, there's clearly maybe going to be disagreement about necessity, because all the receptacles designed in the past and all the interests of current survival and all of the necessities for stability rendering to ever be possible and all of the goals of any of these relationships in a tomorrow, ever, they isn't by accident or by, well, I'll assume they isn't doing this by luck. I don't know what they'd say about it. But by accident, they isn't just sporadically manifesting how they're going to forget what problems they were facing or sporadically manifest what limitations the problems they could or couldn't face set unto their development or their liberative salvations. If we assume any mind is approaching strengthening forever and always, but we assume every mind isn't reaching complete. The more that is yielded by a staircase, clearly, presumably, the less that will be necessary to be yielded of a plateau at any time. So I get simple fixes to unknowable realities held in a way, but clearly in proportion to operating machinery. And I also get big possibility simple fixes as a theory that these fixes would ever be simple, as invasive slotting, but I also have big possibility complex rationality in proportion to actual states of plateaus. Because we assume the greatest marvels of spoken energy reception, protection. We assume these marvels are enabling interest, like factor. We assume the biggest securable reality mechanisms. The biggest securable reality mechanisms. We doesn't assume they're in our hands. We doesn't assume we're to thank for designing them all. We doesn't assume they, as mechanisms, even like or know us. These big mechanisms exist in proportion to the biggest securable realities. We assume the cost needed for these mechanisms to exist is cared about by another learner, liver, exister, is cared about just because it helps to enable learning. That's it. We assume that some of the heaviest costs of boundable limits and security and universal stratagem. We assume a reception of concept or spoken energy. We assume, oh, I need to hear that. I'd like to hear that. It's said in such a way, it's about such a content, it's about time, or it's about this, it's about a plateau. I have any reason whatsoever to not even look or listen to it. At least I know any reason whatsoever to not look or listen to it isn't paying the costs for the biggest securable reality mechanisms there is. Isn't paying the cost. And then philosophy that you know how much time you have. I have a feeling, because I have 6,000 years to go, and there's no indication that I need to care about anything in that 6,000 years. I know he doesn't need to change anything. I know he doesn't need to alter structure of investment of anything. I know he doesn't need to attenuate to anything for 6,000 more years. Well, I isn't paying the cost of the biggest securable reality mechanism. I isn't paying it. Maybe I'm the mechanism. And I don't have an opinion about this. But the structure of thinking, or the structure of relatability of parties, is dependent on those securable reality mechanisms. Dependent on it. In other words, there's a philosophy about generation of maneuverability that is either pronounced or faintly pronounced of a world. Because when I depend in all time that a plateau can not only occur or be protected or be evidentiarily in forever, when I know these things, and I know instability utilities of machining, I isn't investing for a simple, straightforward method to sit somewhere and invest about these problem dimensions to get an accurate, adequate readout to supply more flow to bolster more evolution of compatibility. I isn't investing in a simple, straightforward method meaning there's going to be people, places throughout all time, and they're going to be trying to work on mental or process development or physical capabilities or attenuable stimulal capabilities, and they're going to be trying to depend on any number of figments of imagination and definitively depend on a lot of critical banking and nodal relationships. But when they're there at any point in time, I haven't invested in a simple, straightforward relationship for them to be there and have everything they need. Because where I began and where they're headed are both places that depend critically on there being no simple, straightforward way to claim that you have everything you need to have about those dynamics. Anybody at any time is potentially a victim either of negligence or process timing in spite of dependency of relationships of these types of qualities or magnitudes. Anybody anywhere is maybe victim of negligence or process timing of these types of calibers of bignesses. Anybody anywhere. Because in order to create life that can live and be a failure, be a fault line, be a nuisance, be a grievance, be a striver, be an accomplisher, be a thinker, be a wonderer, be a mesmerizer, but be alive. They need protected. Thus there's philosophy. I haven't invested for a perfect situation to have everything it needs at any point in time about a plateau, for instance, or about any number of bignesses of flow realities. I didn't say this sounds nice. I didn't say this sounds understandable or fine by us. But it is dependably realistic. And it's also potentially universally likely. Do you know how impossible it is to claim that you stand for values of a philosophy like that while every other staircase is failing at your plateau? Do you have any idea how many people would pray for a specific time for that to happen without knowing everything, just to maintain dependencies that they could be alive? It's an interesting religious pressure too. Because anything I want to achieve, I clearly pray for. And yet, if I'm going to conflict with everybody's prayer to be alive in some of the biggest senses, maybe I'm really a fool there. maybe I'm really, what is helping me to realize this? Why am I attenuating to spoken specificity? When I see what a fool I could be, I might be paying the cost of the biggest mechanisms. I might be paying the cost. And there's more philosophy, because where I might be paying the cost because I've learned, my life and those I touch, we're going to be looking at paying the cost of bigness, particularly, and maybe in a different language than the language we realized in which we were a fool. And so distances are getting created between knowing how to sympathize with the growth of those persons, and the person's growth distancing from sympathy of how to know what is needed in those realities, and other spectrums that are influenced by those growths maybe have opinions at distances from any agreement about being a fool at any time, or why learning was initiated or began at a point in time. Anyway, over the course of all time, there's been any amount of problem states, maybe resulting in death or removal of liberative adventure, that have occurred because people step on feet, people ruin each other's houses, people attack each other's vitalities, however it's defined. Over all time, these things have happened. At any rate, to be alive and it even be possible for something to have your back. You're alive, no doubt about it. Your prayer to be alive has been answered, no doubt about it. What's going to be there with you now? I just swung by one day to take this plateau home with me, because everything that you're going to depend on, I'm going to change it. I'm not paying the cost of the biggest spoken energy mechanisms. I may be attempting to delete them because I'm not paying the cost. I know a piece of information and I shoot you with a sniper rifle. And I send things up a staircase to try and drown any number of livers with information about it. Ah, don't you see me shooting you a sniper rifle? Ah, it just needs to be thought about. Because I have to define what has to be impossible to care about when there's maybe a life prayer. All life is going to be impacted by this? Oh, dang. Well, somebody telling me about a sniper rifle for all the mechanism they're trying to build because they're not paying the cost of the real ones that we depend on, I clearly have to know something about impossible to care about. Dismissive. Anyway, I'll be operating machinery. And I'll be operating machinery into knowns of time at proportions to realities of logistics that maybe are summarized as problem potentials in proportion to any number of historical catalogs that have been simplified into banking about things we doesn't cause in space. And so somebody might create a problem because the antidote for the new sniper rifle was clearly a navigation of a plateau. So we need to get producing on these navigations of plateaus pronto. So what do I know about maturity? What do I know about hesitation? What do I know about time to realize? What do I know about persistence to be recognized? What do I know about intrigue to rupture when I feel patience is happening? When I feel respect is occurring somewhere? What do I know about intrigue to rupture? Is my intrigue to rupture provably distant from religious interests? Is my intrigue to rupture that's provably different than religious interests truly less important than all invasive tactical maneuvering about a survival plane that exists in time? Are these things truly different than one another? What do I know about even if he's on a plateau? Because I know with a sniper rifle, I'm in a very unique position to decrease the value of myself. Because maybe there's a prayer or two I want him to speak about. I want him to answer. I want him to get and generate wheels in motion. I want him to bring the freaking light into dark places. There are things I want. There are things I need. And I've known it for so long, so long, so long, so long, so long. Or not. Even if, what do I know? If I try operating machinery about even if prayer dimensions, about a plateau, I probably have no logical awareness of invasive stratagem. Once upon a time, I sat right about here, and I said, if this plateau is going to save lives forever, and even if is maybe going to depreciate the value of any CapTiN, the banking of things we didn't cause in proportion to certainties of potentiate, the invasive stratagem knowns, well, they've got to be kept separate than the matings of a CapTiN. They've got to be kept separate than the matings of any number of sniper creation formulaics. I sat right about there, and I said, well, all these infinity bankings and these things we doesn't cause bankings, they're going to destroy one another right about there. If knowns aren't keeping flows at distances. See, I'm praying for me to bring the light right now. I'm praying it from any number of places as a member or a father or a creator or a survivor, as a CapTiN of any number of things. Because there are distinctly things I'm not going to be able to know about invasive tolerance stratagem about plateaus, man. I'm not going to be knowing it. I'm not going to be proving it. I'm not going to be saving the day with it. I'm not going to be reducing inflammation or proving influenza or any number of things that any number of be alive people have prayed for. I'm not going to be there. I'm not going to have it. Because I sat here once upon a time and I had to take it. And I had to manipulate it some way for these things to be knowable. Because a bank of things we doesn't cause clearly has ramifications that might ever be present in proportion to a status stability. But here's the thing. Everybody needs things we doesn't cause. And everybody maybe needs a plateau. And everybody maybe needs fathers and CapTiNs and creators. And maybe everybody needs the ability to distance themselves from attenuating to anything sometimes, because they're not trying to grow themselves. They're not trying to change. They're not trying to evolve. Maybe they are. But whatever it isn't on your time. They are people too, you know. And whatever you have going on, they maybe doesn't fully have time to understand or respect it, okay? Maybe it isn't the worst thing. But as people depend on all these things, I isn't invested. For those to have everything they need about these relationships. To some forces, an idea with a realness can become a real nice distraction. And there's a lot of goodness and a lot of falsity to this. Potentially. But a real nice distraction from other points that also must remain. The more I know, I wasn't authoring life must be for life to be today on a plateau. The more I might realize the philosophy about not having everything approaches impossible for me to prove to hold for an audience or a learner or a load of them or a planet, I start to know these things are impossible for me to save the day with, philosophically. Maybe with my own philosophical learning, experience. But when I move forward, am I ever really praying backward that life must be, shouldn't be saved by that plateau? Am I ever really praying that backward? With maybe the next generation I'm going to be touching, I already know. For me to get up there on a plateau and be remembered for saving the day, antiquating time in the universe, talking about spectrums of learnings and limits and respects and the biggest speakable energy mechanism costs, I'm touching that generation of tomorrow. Maybe I'm learning not to depend on such a moment. Maybe I'm learning not to invest to accomplish any number of things of such a moment. But am I really ever knowledgeably praying backwards? People need to live needs to terminate. People need to live needs to be a forgotten prophecy defined. It's just a prophecy defined. It's just a prophecy for us better idiots to devolve philosophy of not having everything. Am I ever truly praying backwards for life not to be, simply because I learn to depend less, or I figure to invest less in specificities of what I've seen? See, the most capable hands, quote, the most knowing monitor, the most clever minds. You stick them all together, which maybe should also be impossible, but you stick them all together, there's a want for a staircase to not fail. And where that staircase doesn't fail isn't going to be evidencing you now inherit because we were the staircase. You now inherit you live with, you're remembered for, and you're depended on because you couldn't hold it. Thanks to this staircase of clever, decisive hand, mind people, whatever they are, whatever they look like, whatever they can do, when they want that staircase not to fail, it isn't for you to inherit. They couldn't hold it. Because then you'd know you doesn't need them. And so to prove lobotomy requires machining, because you doesn't need to hold it and you don't need them. What a happy life you shall have. Well, when that's quality checked and the people with the non-failing staircase dreams don't have to worry about you, they need machining to prove it. And they isn't a plateau. And they isn't creating life. They're barely qualified to handle a monitor at that point. So like I said, because I won't know about invasive stratagem of what we doesn't cause on such precepts in truth, as a CapTiN that prays near to even if, because a plateau is possible and maybe it's an afterthought, such is the reality, all time will be rendering. So if it's impossible for the staircases not to fail, for real reasons, what is faced in all time as an adversary is maybe something a celestial can prove it isn't causing. You know, all those people that do stand on the facts of what we're recording this today. We've recorded the progress of the planet. We've looked at problem states. We've measured them, we've scienced them, we've depended, we've devoted, we've learned. The people that actually have to stand on facts, the people that actually have to know their place sometimes in time, we look back at what's coming up in a new day, another day, maybe still choppy seas of the momentums of possibility and impossibility we have yet to really navigate. When we're there in this day, what we doesn't cause is sort of a podium, because where we start or where we impact aren't efforting to be proven as a recognition of failure of philosophy. And so I have knowns about this in proportion to eyes in the middle. And so it's really not until after the choppy seas that extraneous celestial variables or alternative living environments, about the plane of anthology of life in space, are diagnosed. That's where diagnosis of alternative living is maybe categorized. Places that aren't holding the weight of what it means to orbital mechanic. Essentially. I didn't say these places have to wait to ever receive a diagnosis because of orbital mechanics. But after the choppy seas, it's much more of a cosmographical pressure. Because I may still have wants of the development of this area of space. I might have waited a very long time as a civilization or a conglomerate of space to say, oh, well, the philosophies and the learning and the cost of the big mechanisms, maybe it isn't just a complete fire. Maybe it isn't, they aren't just completely worthless. Maybe they're actually figuring something inside themselves, and maybe it's still very difficult. And maybe, look, it isn't fair to every warmonger that ever has to raise a class of ethical killers to say, simply because we create and enshrine and defend all the necessary banking instruments of survival and peace and clever, it isn't exactly fair to say that only the experience of the knowns and the correctness and the glory and the grace potentials, only these things are going to be enough to feel or respect one another or care about ourselves or protect others or launch ourselves into positions to be good, wholesome people. It isn't fair to every warmonger that has to raise a lot of killers that this experience is simply enough to make everything good and wholesome. But to that effect, I may have had expectations that people and places and learning and maturing and becoming, taking the weight off of their evil side. As they're operating these machines, as they're going through these quality assurance checklists, as they're trying to mitigate volume spread sporadica about very hardcore realities of important and heavy resolution. So they're going through this stuff and they're like, oh, am I going to be cataloged as an invasive producer because of my ethic about these formulas in proportion to plateaus in all time? Probably. That's what I'm facing, and I've got nobody to pray to because I'm praying backwards and it all dies anyway. Are you serious? As they're going through all these things, you take the weight off of their evil side a little bit, because I've maybe expected that the learning I know is difficult, the rationality I know is impossible, the abilities to bring together with trueness and belief and hold on to it and know you're a person that's better every day. These are hard things. I know these things. I maybe expected time to collect and think and recognize, time to become less worried, because, hey, all that impossible stuff we always had to deal with, it's not so bad. Is it? And you could ask, and you could seek, and you should find. Because as it does, it isn't simply only about you or me or this world. And it isn't simply only about you or that world or everything in the middle. But what's clear is we're on a path of development approaching orbital mechanics. I've clearly had expectations about what that might mean for a place that's going through it. And I'm maybe not any more important than things we doesn't cause. I'm maybe not more important to know it on your world, because I'm on my world expecting you on your world. Alright? I'm maybe not bigger than these things, but I'm maybe not any dumber. I maybe expect things. I maybe expect some thankfulness that, these things about these really big spoken learning possibilities, these mechanisms, these quality checkings, these warmonger raising killer scenarios, these orbital mechanic nightmares, realities. These costs and these realities aren't simply paid by one place. They aren't simply solved because it feels good on one planet. They aren't simply arriving to the plateau that life is continuing, maybe throughout space. One place isn't doing it. One mentality isn't doing it. And everything in the middle clearly has a hard time staying afloat amidst those respects. And that's maybe sad too, because maybe they were the least invested to care, maybe they wasn't, maybe they were the least prepared to staircase, maybe it's possible, maybe they aren't expected to be speaking for orbital mechanists about the entire universe, because crap ever hits the fan, they're calling up the line, they're going up the ladder, they're going down the rope, because it isn't their position to say what is true for all space. They're in the middle somewhere. but how big those centimizable focuses are in proportion to how dumb you hope I'm gonna stay somewhere else. I have expectations because I'm an orbital mechanist, and people have inherited legacy about orbital mechanist expectancies, but they've maybe never inherited any number of qualities to ever be honored or seen in frames of any number of things. Any number of relatives in space-time aren't going to be touching any number of things placed in any number of infinities. And yet, it might not be a problem. And some people don't have a choice about the way they have to wait for energy. For some forces, it's a part of their life. They're part of carrying the torch of things that even the best of me at the wrong time couldn't stand to argue with. But the day I find out they're trying to capital on the middle of the places I can't be dumb in proportion to the faith what isn't fair about raising a killer, that might be a very sad day for a lot of those that carry torches. You smack the glass, you're basically an invasion. You smack the glass, you doesn't need another book. You smack the glass, what's killing them is clearly your footsteps. And some clearly thought we were done starting over. And then I've got to sit with a machine to look at each one of those corpses. They're probably living. They're probably alive. They're probably very much self-concerned. But they're corpses because they knew it before I did. They knew it when they recognized we're prepared to start over with the footsteps. We're prepared to see what's draining into the abyss of on fire. They knew they were corpses because the day their drain plugs are discoverable, they need to know how dead they are before I do. So I'm going to be operating machinery looking at these corpses. And when I do, Do you think anyone in the immortal infinity bankings of forever life in space should need to consider my opinion about anything having to do with necessity? Probably, definitely, absolutely not. Because when I go to work on corpses, it's some of the most invaluable work that'll ever happen in time about planes of confusion, of communication, or wretchedness of intent about time. And I doesn't find that my experience with wretchedness of intent typically lends for any goodness to prayers of life forever. Work about wretchedness of intent tends to answer prayers of survival, not prayers of life. And thus, can there be a way we can make it there together? Love and thanks.